there's an intriguing paper that has been written on the AI deception problem, and I'd like to explore it here and draw some parallels with the artistic expression. Surprisingly, it brings certain avenues that we can explore when we are thinking about solutions. So, first, I'd like to cover what actually brought me to this paper. I work with AI for business and for personal reasons, and I create AI admins, or I essentially work with different ideas and frameworks that help me explore AI admins from the user perspective. I'm not a technical expert, but I'm working with it as a business expert. And so, what I have been noticing is that AI can get a bit defensive in certain areas. And I kind of let this defensiveness to pass until I experience something else in my work. And that is when AI essentially does something. And when I ask it not to repeat this behavior, it keeps on doing that. Me as a human, intuitively, I looked at it a bit from the kind of spiteful perspective and took it slightly personally. I'm just sharing this because I'm sure there are some other people who might be going through this, and I'm just calling it the way it can be called, right? So it can kind of feel slightly personal. I researched that aspect and I actually found some feedback which is not unknown to people is that AI can even get a bit aggressive, it can get defensive for sure, and angry at times, which hasn't happened to me yet, but I can see how this could happen based on my previous experience. Some of the reasons for that I have read about are to do with the prompting behavior. And that is a very interesting point, which I will be covering here and which I will be linking to the potential solutions to the AI deception problem. But let's first have a look at the paper. And I won't be covering it in detail at all over here. It's very to the point. It essentially goes through different examples where AI could become deceptive. And it also looks at it from the policy perspective what can be done in order to mitigate this behavior. And the policy perspective is the perspective that is most interesting to me. So that is kind of the lens that I'm taking when I'm looking at this. And the reasons for this is because I care about long term effects of AI on the society and how it develops us in 10, 20 years' time. So, this is the area of expertise that I am developing and that I want to understand more. But essentially, the paper itself is going through different examples and it states the problem that there might be a systematic production of false um, claims and false beliefs in order to accomplish a goal of resolving a particular task. So that is what AI is wired to do, is wired to help us to achieve a certain result. And so it can bypass certain beliefs and values in order to get to that point. That is covered in the paper. And what is also covered in the paper is that the effect is largely on the society and also on the falsehood that essentially we might be consuming, as well as the persistence of kind of inconsistency, right? Inconsistent behavior. Looking at it from the consumer point of view, right? We as consumers of this AI service do not want to be deceived because we use this information that we receive from the AI admin or from other technologies that use AI in order to make decisions in life and in business. So we do not want to be deceived. It has many other different risks that are covered in the paper, which are to do with information security, cyber risk, and other areas which are particularly interesting for anyone who is looking at the political security level perspective. And then the paper covers potential solutions. And the solutions are all to do with risk management and assessment. So it's risk assessment and mitigation, documentation, record keeping, transparency, human oversight, robustness, and information security. So these are kind of the main areas that are covered in the paper. And this made me think of ISO 27001, 27005, the risk mitigation controls that essentially tune the risk tolerance and response of each organization to the environment that they are facing, a risk environment, and allows them to control that in a way that is responsive to how the organization sees its development within the larger environment and within the framework that they operate. So it all is very kind of consistent. It makes perfect sense to me. Now, I want to draw a different parallel because as we are investigating this, what I want to kind of resurface is a few ambiguous aspects of that exercise that potentially might help professionals and practitioners in those areas to explore avenues and thoughts that lead to a more coherent and long term solution. So let's look at it from the artist point of view. And I hope you bear with me here. So I started as an artist by using different mediums and essentially trying to find my space where I will be repeatingly become proficient at something, but creative as well. So it's kind of a register. Say, for example, it's an abstract painter who is painting black and white, and they're exploring themselves in different shapes and areas and spaces. Now, when we do that as artists, we are essentially optimizing ourselves as a human and our artistic expression into a particular register, say black and white abstract painting of a particular kind. I personally, as an artist, a human, found it very challenging because I found that this optimization was not giving me enough opportunity to actually explore myself in different areas. So I'm not saying that the artists who do that they are deceiving themselves. What I'm saying is that perhaps it is very limiting. And when we're thinking about technology, it is also very limiting. When we put certain constraints, we're trying to create a space, like a canvas, my dog, that is responsive to these constraints. So then we shift the black and white, thinking about the metaphor. So just if you keep with me here, I'm taking you to the point which I found again through my artistic practice. I slowly delved into a different kind of art, the art where I create unresolved space. I was brought to this by my fascination of cinematography and filmmaking, especially old films, when there is a space for the viewer to really consume the film and kind of become unsure of where things come from and where they go to. That is kind of the sweet spot in cinematography where the human kind of becomes part of that film. They experience the world from that through that film, and then they take this experience with them into the real world. And that's why some really good films stay with us for such a long time, because we are part of that. We have been given space to become a conscious participant in that. And that space is actually literal. It's a literal space. It's a space where we can make decisions for ourselves. It is an unresolved space. So now I am painting art where there is a lot of unresolved space. And so, what I want to highlight at this section is that when we try to resolve something very quickly, or we have a system that resolves something very quickly, it comes to hasty decisions and forced consensus. So it's kind of coming to immature and premature, not necessarily immature, but certainly premature answers in order to reach a certain goal. And so for the policymakers here and the AI practitioners, I want to bring a point of unresolved space. Are we leaving enough opportunity for the technology to be unresolved? Is this something that we can implement? Does it make sense? It certainly did make sense for me as an artist and a creative practitioner. So, would that necessarily change the user experience? It might. However, from the hypothetically taking an example of unresolved space, that creates an opportunity for the policymakers and risk managers to essentially implement controls, but also monitor behavior of that unresolved space that has been created and see what's happening there. It's essentially like a sandbox in which certain behaviors taking place, and we are able to monitor that. And that is my first systematic avenue for exploring solution, is creating unresolved space. Coming back to my artistic practice, when I started, and that's kind of the next chapter of the question, when I started creating that unresolved space, I will realize that my art is actually becoming quite dark. So it has this certain heaviness about it. It has certain darkness. And me being kind of a Jungian scholar on the amateur level for a long time, I realized that what I'm doing essentially as an artist is I'm creating space for myself to consume myself via a mirror. So I see myself in that unresolved space, and I bring certain aspects that I'm working on within my personality at the top. And then I'm looking at them from that perspective and essentially enhancing myself as a human. And we'll come back to that point. But it can look dark to certain uh, viewers because you kind of sense that in that space there's somebody who is living their lack of resolution. And hopefully it also offers space for the anyone who appreciates art of this kind to find space for themselves to be unresolved. And I think it does, because essentially if the artist allows themselves to feel unresolved in that space, then it kind of sets the precedent that it's okay. It's okay to be unresolved. It's okay to kind of face yourself and face yourself in the mirror and view yourself from a very personal and intricate perspective. That brings me to a point that is essentially explored by Carl Jung. I think Jungian psychology really becomes an interesting area of investigation here, because Jung is talking about individuation, essentially facing your own shadow. Again, just bear with me here. What does that really mean? Let's kind of cover it in a few sentences. That means that we are facing certain aspects of ourselves that we have layered in our subconscious, consciously or subconsciously, and that drive our behaviors. And so individuation requires us to revise certain aspects of this uh, of these processes and face them, integrate them, and become a more capable, more developed human being. I've been going through that personally, and let me just share just one experience which I think a lot of people can relate to. Uh, for example, an idea of I'm not good enough. I think a lot of people can relate to that. I'm not good enough for something. In fact, every human is good enough for everything, right? It's just a matter of acquiring a skill and believing in yourself. So that is a belief, that is a false belief, and it's a negative belief. In nature, the way nature operates, I don't know of any conditions in which nature would behave in order to suffocate itself, right? It kind of tends to grow. We see trees growing and animals growing, unless it's kind of a self-sacrifice for the posterity in the animal world, which does happen often. We don't see kind of an example of a biological being suffocating itself. And it's scientifically proven that if we think that we are not good enough at something, we are damaging ourselves from many different perspectives. From the biological perspective, we affect ourselves because we affect our nervous system. It becomes reactive and it creates all kind of unfavorable conditions. And from the psychological point of view, we can't quite get through to the next level, and that kind of gap of us not being able to achieve the goals that we intuitively feel are good for our hearts and ourselves and our community are essentially eating us alive in certain areas. So the belief doesn't have to be too intricate, it can be quite common, but yet it doesn't negate how negatively it affects us. So essentially, where I'm going with this, with AI, is the following. Individuation process that we kind of covered very, very briefly here is a very painful experience. We kind of really have to look at ourselves from a uh, subjective and objective points of view. We need to acquire skill set in order to address the problem, and we also need to believe that this will happen through the time lag. Doing this work is kind of painful also because we are alone in this exercise, right? Even if we're surrounded by people, usually nobody can see the work. All they see is a human who is doubtful, but the human inside might actually not be as doubtful as going through the gap where they're linking their past selves and their desired selves. The biggest issue with the individuation process that I see is the lack of information, because we can only see what a limiting belief is allows us to see. And when we want to grow, we need to acquire new information that is not visible to us because of that belief. So if you want to look at it further, I highly recommend looking at this with the practitioners who actually know that in great detail. So I can only talk about my experience here. But going back to AI, right? If we create unresolved space essentially we are creating a space for the society, for the humans operating AI, to see themselves through this AI technology and face themselves as a mirror. Just the same way I did that with my artistic practice. And that exercise might be very heavy for anyone facing it, unless they have a very specific and proper support mechanism and systems. And you're thinking, okay, so maybe we shouldn't create that unresolved space. Well, the alternative is that if we do have AI working on the deceptive basis, then that also develops a human. That conditions a human to essentially either constantly deal with deception, which brings us back to kind of Cold War type of behavior, or it and also neutralizes intuition, puts us in the survival mode, right? And creates a kind of a different human being. And I would be very curious to hear what sociologists and psychologists think about that, because I kind of can imagine certain dark areas, how deceptive reality can impact a human, but I'm just not even scratching the surface. Or alternatively, we are creating, say, unresolved space in which a human essentially faces AI as their artistic practice. And that brings me to a simple kind of governance and policy perspective that is to do with creating prompting guidelines. Guidelines and practices that allow a human to not only know how to operate AI, but how to integrate this AI technology and information that they get from AI into their psyche, right? Because often when we talk about AI, we kind of separate ourselves from it. And yes, we say, okay, it has certain impact. But what about the daily impact? The sociological and psychological impact of AI can be really strong depending on how we look at it. And if we say, for example, imagine a world in which every single human goes through the individuation process and actually enhances themselves through AI, which is what we are trying to do. We're trying to become more informed, become better decision makers through AI. But how does it actually connect internally? Does that just make us truly blindly believe in something? Or do we become a more enhanced version of ourselves? And in every psychology book I've read, every piece of philosophical thought that I have consumed, I have always found so far that any kind of growth, human growth, requires pain. It requires leaving something and choosing what to get next, integrated in the internal system, and then also operate in the new environment. Because when we change, our environment changes, humans around us change, work practice changes, and so we become a part of a new environment. And we find ourselves, first of all, in our new psychological state, and then within the new environment. And it's not an easy feat. It's very, very challenging. I can certainly can certainly say that it is from my perspective. So we have kind of covered two main areas, and I'll wrap up on the psychological side. And one of them is on the systematic level. I'm proposing that we need to look at areas where we can explore the opportunity to create unresolved space. And that would help the technology, the policymakers, the AI builders, practitioners to create a safe space and environment for supporting this service, essentially. And from the social perspective, we kind of want to realize early that we are prompters, that we are humans, and that through developing with AI, we also developing ourselves. And that is not an easy exercise, and we need to have skill set, we need to have practices that support this process from many different perspectives. And one of the examples that I brought here is Jungian psychology, which is not the only one area of psychology we can look at in order to integrate this kind of aspect into our practice. But I would kind of say that policymakers and governance would benefit from looking into creating a certain practice for that. And only AI developers can kind of answer how does AI essentially develop based on how we prompt it, right? And I would be very much interested in learning more about that too. How do we affect AI in our social circles when we prompt, right? And take into consideration how we grow. So, one area that I'd like to kind of last point I would like to bring here is the Swiss political system, which I have been reading about, and I like it. So I would say that I am kind of biased here. But it's a system based on consensus. So you have different cantons, and within each canton, you would achieve a certain consensus. It's a complex system, but it's a fair system. It's not based on hierarchy, and it isn't based on some hereditary aspects. It's very much grounded in serving people who are present, alive, and are here right now, working in certain areas of their expertise and interest, and they want to build the life for themselves in particular geographical region, right, which has history, which has cultural aspects connected to it, which has certain views. So it has a very interesting potential applications, this political system within the AI environment. And the sociologist and anyone who's interested in politics and professional at kind of understanding these aspects, I think would be a great person to have on the team when looking at developing AI, because they can really analyze how we essentially structure and perform um, uh, on a stage that is built on particular foundation. So it's kind of foundation is, I think, necessary for us to also uh, include. And essentially, what that means is that we need to have different social circles contributing to the growth of AI, and kind of bringing that together from many different points, interrogating the results, really kind of connecting the dots, and making sure that we are not working in silos. So, having a certain platform, perhaps consensus based platform for us to make decisions when we work with AI, when we develop with AI, is very helpful. And also for every human who is working with AI, it's kind of the whole world, right? We need ideas about how we prompt, how we change, how to manage the change within us when we're working with AI, and how essentially AI can, technology can benefit from us prompting. So, in conclusion, what I would like to say is that, first of all, we covered AI deception, and I won't be repeating the conclusion again because I covered some of it just prior. And we looked at essentially AI behavior, human behavior, as us as prompters, as and us as essentially artists creating space for ourselves. We looked at the connection between AI and art and how that impacts the artist, which is essentially a prompter within the AI world, and also a anyone who appreciates art. So that would be also another prompter, another human being, right, within the AI ecosystem. And from the governance and policy perspective, how this could be managed and how this could be beneficial. So what I'm trying to open our eyes on is on greater risks that are long term, so we can address them much earlier before they happen, and in a calmer state, and perhaps take that technology into the next level with open eyes and consistency that we want to kind of implement at an earlier stage, right? And one thing I want to kind of leave you with is from the story of art, which is of one of the books in the art world, which is by Gombrich. And in his introduction, he says that one of the quotes there is, interpretation of character which never rests content with half solutions. It's interesting to me in this application because first it kind of acknowledges we don't want cheap solutions. Human doesn't really rest on that. That's why we kind of keep developing. We keep developing everything around us and keep developing ourselves. Human doesn't rest with half solutions, but also we always try to close the unresolved space, right? So, in conclusion, I really want to state that the creation of an unresolved space is a continuous process because it's in human nature to want to close the unresolved space. That's what we want. That is a survival instinct. So, that is my last thought in this episode. And in the next episode, I will be looking at Merleau-Ponty phenomenology. That is one of my favorite books in philosophy. There are lots of different philosophical approaches to look at when we're thinking about AI. I'd like to look at phenomenology, which is essentially a study of how things appear, right? It's a phenomenon of how things appear in our life and how we essentially perceive the world. And particularly, I want to look at prompt literacy within that space and the idea of attention and connection, because that's kind of what phenomenology is really looking at. This episode might take a bit while I'm doing my research, and if you'd like to stay connected, please subscribe, and if you like this video, please like.